What's up everybody, this is Ryan here. So a couple days ago I made a video talking about software architecture and the term model and how it fits into the various three-layer architectures that we typically see on the various platforms for graphical user interface programming. So I had a question on that video about basically what is a data model and UI model and those sorts of things. So before I get into the details here, I'm going to suggest if you haven't already seen that video, you're going to want to go and watch that because there's some more information in that about the term model and what it means in general and sort of like a more architectural sense. What I'm going to be talking about in this video is a specific kind of model, and so instead of using a whole bunch of big words to explain what it is, let's just look at some code and you should be able to understand it from there. So in that previous video, I did show an example of a data model, but what I'll do here is I'll show you a more specific non-pseudocode type example. So it pretty much doesn't matter whether you're working in XML, JavaScript, Android, Swift, Kotlin, whatever platform or language you're working on. Sooner or later, you're very likely going to have some kind of class, which all it really does is it just collects a bunch of data which is somehow relevant to some particular object in your application. So it could be like a user. In this case, what I'm showing you here is this is a data model, which conceptually represents a note in a note-taking application. Now, for those who are not familiar with Kotlin, we do, in the Kotlin language, have kind of a specific modifier for this data class, and it just adds a couple extra functions, which makes it easier to work with these sorts of things. But basically what we're looking at here is it's just a simple data model. So this term model, when used as a noun, is like a representation of a real thing. So here we're representing a note or a user's conceptual note object as a data model. So there, in that previous video, I talked about a couple different kinds of model. So again, not everyone really agrees on these definitions all of the time, but what I'll do in different cases is, so if I'm building like a more complicated multi-module application, usually I'll have either like a domain or a common module in my application, and this will contain data models, such as this node object, which don't have any kind of third-party library stuff going on, and they're just very general. And this is basically to create some kind of like a neutral kind of object, which, let's say if I have like a front-end Swift or a front-end Android or front-end web, all of these different sort of modules can depend on this common plain node object. So if you're not doing like multi-module builds, then don't worry about this too much, but there is one thing you might want to worry about. So generally speaking, even in a simple application, I'll have some kind of really plain data model which doesn't have any libraries in it. And let's say I'm working with a tool like Realm or Room, those are databases, or if I'm working with a tool like Firebase, very often in the back end of my application, I will also have similar node objects which contain the different annotations and the boilerplate stuff that that particular back-end library requires. And what I'll end up doing is I will map, say, from this node object, the plain one, to, say, a Room registered Room node object. So again, Room is just a library, a database library, and it requires you adding these sorts of annotations in. So I'll map to and from these different forms of data models as I pass data to and from the back end of the application. So when I say data model, this is exactly what I'm talking about, just in case there's still any confusion. So we're talking about something which really just stores and contains data. And in the back end, so for example, in this application, I have a couple different kinds of data models in the back end. Like I've got a Room note, I have a Firebase note, which is still pretty similar to the original node object, but hopefully you kind of see where I'm getting at here. So we have sort of like in the simplest sense, just a plain data container object. In Java, you'll have your different fields and then your getters and setters. Here in Kotlin, we just specify the properties, and then they already have getters and setters. And yeah, that's generally what we're talking about here. So there was one other term which I mentioned in that previous video, which was either UI model or sort of view model. So I'll show you one more example about this now. This is a particular case where this term view model does not necessarily mean strictly a data model, what I just showed you. A lot of people, when they're doing, say, model view, view model architecture, they'll have this thing called view model, and it will also kind of control the user interface. So we'll look at some code and I'll kind of break it down, but just understand again, not everyone really uses these words the same ways. So taking one last look at our regular plain old data model or note data model, we don't have necessarily super specific information about the user interface. Now obviously things like image URL probably have something to do with the interface, the user interface, but in this case we're basically just sending through our application a very neutral data model. When I'm talking about view model or UI model, I'm going to just say UI model because unfortunately due to the model view view model pattern and people filling this thing called view model with logic, that term has gotten quite confused. So I'm going to say UI model to refer to what you see here. I call it a note detail view model in this application, but just understand it's not my fault. There's some conflicting names in this particular case. So I'm just going to say UI model for now. And so what I'm basically talking about with a UI model is it's kind of similar. So we have a class which holds a bunch of data. So kind of similar to what we saw before with our plain data model. But it holds data which is like directly relevant to a particular user interface screen. So things that we need to know: is the user in private mode? What is the basically the state of the note object? So in this particular case, we have something that is tailor-made for a specific feature or a specific set of views in our application. And this is not the kind of thing, of course, you would put in like the middle or back end of your application, because we really want to try and keep the front end and the back end separate. So just to finish this video off, like I said before and in the previous video, the term model has many different uses, not only in the English language, but also to programmers. It can be used as a verb to model something, to represent something. We can use it as like a noun, so in the case of a data model. And we can also think of it in like an architectural sense. So the model being any class or function which has the responsibility of structured access and storage to data. So like data, I/O, and persistence and that kind of thing. So lots of different definitions, but hopefully that at least cleared up a few things for you. If you liked the video, please do me a favor and hit the like button down below. And if you have any questions about software architecture, programming in general, Android development, Kotlin, this, that, and the other, then do consider asking down below, and I might get back to you in another video. Thank you so much for watching, and peace out.